I can't. I don't know. I don't know if I'm supposed to be on a PA. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. All right. So I guess everyone can hear me now. We're still waiting for a whiteboard. There it is. Here we go. Great. So my kind of plan for today will be to go into the most concise possible specification of the family of consensus protocols, of which Casper the friendly ghost is part, and this consensus protocol is kind of in some way the core of going to be the core of the Mercury release, and that it's for the consensus protocol side as opposed to the Rho VM side, so there's going to be. So I'm going to basically describe a family of protocols that includes the consensus protocol that Kent and everyone is working hard at implementing. I'm gonna just want to do a show of hands. Who here feels comfortable with set theory? Set theory? Yes, that's very good. Good. So at least some of you will follow the first portion of this. The plan is I'm going to go through the first part, basically give the protocol spec because it's pretty small. I've managed to get it down to a page of math, and then we're going to talk. I was thinking I would give you an option. One of them is to go further into the protocol spec considerations and talk about how we can go do scalability. And the other is maybe we could do a Q&A about all of the various kinds of questions that you might have about proof of stake, consensus protocol scalability, basically anything related to consensus protocols, and even incentive mechanisms for consensus protocols. But first things first, I want to do some math because, whenever there's any audience that understands math, it's always good to do because at least they'll be able to definitely for sure receive the message, if you know what I mean. There's a lot of checksums when you're doing math, just built into the language. I need a marker. I need a marker. Does anyone have a marker? I need a marker to write on this thing. Oh, great. Sweet. Thank you so much. Sweet. So, firstly, though, before I go write down the protocol spec, I'm going to say, I'm going to write it down as protocol states and state transitions. And this is going to be the protocol states of the individual nodes, so of your blockchain node. It's going to start off at a protocol state we call the empty set. Because protocol states are going to be sets of messages. And so you start off not having received any messages, and you're going to receive messages as protocol state transitions. And you're going to go from having a set of messages to having a bigger and bigger set of messages over time. So the protocol states are going to be a set of messages, and they're going to be the corresponding to the individual transitions that individual nodes who run the consensus protocol will take. So I'm going to give you a set of sets. That's going to be the set of protocol states, and then I'm going to give you this protocol state transition relation, which is just a superset. We're going to receive messages. So for those of you who don't understand set theory, so a set just means a collection of things, and a superset means a collection of things that includes the previous collection of things. So A is a superset of B if a collection of things A includes all of the things in B. So when you receive a message, you're going to have a bigger set of messages that includes the previous messages you previously received as kind of the state transition relation. So we're going to have a bunch of things in our messages. No, firstly, let me write down. Let me just start writing some things down. So this is going to be our kind of preliminary protocol states construction, and I already kind of told you it's going to be a set of message, and it's going to be only finite sets of messages. So any finite set of messages is going to be a protocol state. It's kind of preliminary protocol state. We're going to constrain it a little more in a second. And then messages, well, we're going to need some information in our messages because we need to have a consensus protocol, and it's going to need to do some things, like come to consensus on values. And what kind of values we're going to be concerned with? Well, we don't, at this level of abstraction, really care. So we're going to denote it as C. C is some set of consensus values. It's going to be the thing that we're concerned with. In our chain, it's going to end up being, this kind of schedule of of blocks. That's going to be like somewhat concurrent schedule. Maybe one day, this will be the actual row count term of the underlying chain. But somehow we're going to be concerned with some consensus values. But at this level of abstraction, at the level of abstraction of this specification, we're not going to know anything about that. We're going to have a set of validator names. So every message is going to be labeled with a name of the sender. And this is kind of important because in proof of stake, you can only really count on messages from people with deposits. And so unless they have like a deposit, then they're not going to be able to have they're not going to be like able to send messages corresponding to that particular name. And finally, there's going to be a third thing in a message, which is a protocol state. So for those who don't know set theory, this little x here, this multiplication, is called a Cartesian product. What this basically is a big set of things, which has like an element in this set, and one of those, like tupled as a triple. So basically, if M, this is like a set membership symbol, is inside this thing, then it's going to have the following form. It's going to have it's going to be a triple, and we're going to label these so we have some nice English to refer to them. So if something is a message, then it's going to be equal to a triple separated by commas, all these like parens. And we're going to call the first guy the estimate, the second guy the sender, and the third one the justification. Pardon my illegible handwriting. It's only going to get worse. So the messages are all these triples: consensus values, sender, justification. That's what kind of we called them. And somehow this is going to form the basis of our protocol states and of our like whole protocol definition. So the kind of thing to note here is that like we haven't said what the validator names are. We haven't said what the consensus values are. These are going to be kind of parameters of the protocol. We're going to end up. The protocol is going to be defined in terms of things like this. That when you give them will actually be the full specification of the protocol. But until they're given, what we're going to have is a family of protocols corresponding to every possible choice of the parameters. So this is kind of like the most basic structure of our. This is like the kind of preliminary protocol state structure. It's not really our consensus protocol yet, but I want to stop and ask to just make sure that everyone kind of feels that they understand kind of what I mean. The protocol states are sets of messages, and messages are triples of consensus values, validator names, and protocol states. Does that sound reasonable? Sounds okay? All right. I'm glad no one is telling me that this is a circular definition and therefore that it's not well-founded. Because it's totally fine. Yeah, that's right. It does have a fixed point, yeah. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the consensus protocol. Is going to have like some protocol state. Actually, I'm not going to use all of these guys. I'm only going to use some strict subset of them. So I'm going to define some gamma, which is going to be like the actual protocol states, and it's going to be a subset of sigma. Yep.
Why in the message isn't the receiver part of it?
So why is there no receiver in the sender definition? That's a good question. And basically, it's because in these blockchain protocols, we're only broadcasting. Every message is going to be kind of sent to everyone, and so it wasn't naturally part of our instinct, and it turned out not to be necessary for the key theorem that this family of protocols is going to be satisfying. And so, it wasn't really naturally part of our context, and it doesn't turn out to be necessary for the key result. It's kind of I'm not sure if it's never going to be something we add to the messages. But for now, this is like the minimum stuff. You need a consensus value, you need a validator name, and you need a protocol state. And we'll see how all this fits together as a consensus protocol in not too long. So I saw a hand. I don't know where. I saw a hand. No, it's gone. Great. So we're gonna have. I'm gonna give you some constraints that this gamma is going to satisfy. The first one is called the full node condition. So basically for anything in gamma, if we have a message in gamma, then we also have its justification. So if we have a set of messages in this protocol state, and M is in that set of messages, then so is its justification. So this is the full node condition. This basically says, oh look, we're only looking at full nodes. So this will. Our aim here is to focus in on like the most basic problem statement and the most basic. And have like the simplest possible specification that meets all of our kind of desiderata. And so the full node condition is going to help us not deal with annoying things like not knowing, like not having the messages in the justification of a message. So somehow what you need to imagine is that I'm not talking about light clients. I'm not talking about scalable blockchains. I'm only just talking right now about a full node protocol where everyone downloads all the dependencies of all the messages. So that's what this condition is. It's pretty cool condition if you ask me, right? I mean, normally if you have to describe to someone what it means to be a full node, you have to say a few sentences. This is like a few characters. Now we're going to have another condition. But first, I'm going to define something that I haven't defined yet, which is a map from these protocol states under the full node condition to sets of consensus values. So this thing is kind of super important. This is called the estimator. So the estimator, it kind of is inspired by the Bitcoin protocol, the way that it uses this something called the fork choice rule. It like looks at a set of messages, the protocol states or sets of messages, and then it like returns a blockchain, right? It'll pick a blockchain. And so we're kind of going to use this abstraction for all sorts of different consensus protocols. And what we're going to do is we're going to map the sets of messages to just sets of consensus values. So in a binary consensus protocol, it'll return like a set of like a set either containing the 0, a set containing 1, or maybe a set containing 0 or 1. And so this estimator here, we're about to see its role. But it is the thing that relates protocol states to consensus values. So far, our protocol states have only really been related to consensus values through the fact that C shows up in M, but this has been completely unrestrained, right? We're allowing any consensus value here, but this estimator is going to constrain these consensus values. Specifically, we're going to have the following condition. So we had this full node condition. Now we're going to have another condition, which is also a super convenient condition. It is called the valid messages condition. So basically what it says is, oh, look, the estimate of the message is in the estimator of the justification. And now this kind of also reveals a little bit like why I called this thing the justification. Because the justification is used to check the validity of the consensus value in that message. So this is the valid message condition. So basically with this condition, I'm just assuming that the messages are valid. So basically for any set in this set gamma that I'm defining, for any message there, the estimate of that message is in the estimator of the justification. So you're running the protocol, you're a full node because you have all the dependencies of all the messages in your state. So before you look at any message, you have to have its justification. And you're also validating, right? You only accept messages into your protocol state if they meet this validity condition, relating the consensus value to the to the justification via this estimator, which is a generalization of the fork choice rule. It's kind of a lot. So I'm going to stop again and see that and wonder, I'm wondering if you have any questions about maybe the full node condition or the validity condition, the estimator. Yep. P is power set. So power set is this construction that picks out all of the subsets of this thing. And here I wrote finite because it's a finite set. So this is just sets of consensus values. Notably, I didn't mention this, but I'm not allowing the empty set. You're not allowed to. The estimator isn't allowed to return the empty set. Edge case, but I'm sure someone was going to bring it up. So anyone else? Questions? Because we're slowly getting there.
Is that line like
Which line?
the estimator?
The estimator.
Those are all conditions for an estimator to be okay?
Yeah, so for an estimator to be okay, it basically needs to be a map from gamma to sets of consensus values, but it can't return the empty set. That's totally, yeah. This is going to end up being the only constraint on the estimator.
The last one is if the estimator's been met.
Then a message is valid. And furthermore, all messages are valid. So like all the messages in gamma, or all the messages in any of the protocol states in gamma are valid. So this is kind of a simplifying assumption that is going to, let us ignore invalid messages, and also helps us make sense of the world, because like now the consensus values here are not arbitrary. They're no longer arbitrary and completely independent of the values here, but actually the consensus values that you choose here when you make a message has to be in the estimator of the justification. So, how is this a consensus protocol? Well, to be honest, it's not yet, but it will be soon. And the way that we're going to make it a consensus protocol is by making it non-trivial. We're going to add a notion of like decisions. But first, because I want to come up with a safe consensus protocol, I want to define the notion of the Byzantine fault that I'm gonna tolerate. So in consensus protocols, we were trying to build fault-tolerant systems, which means that they are resistant to nodes behaving badly. And so right now, we don't really have much of a notion of what it means for a node to behave at all, other than I mentioned that the state transition relation is a superset. So what a valid node does, as far as we know, is it receives messages, and then receives more messages, and then receives more messages. And that's the only really condition that's been described here. And when you produce a message, it's not going to be received by a valid node unless that node has all the message in its justification and that message is valid. So as an attacker, the only thing you could really do to influence a valid node is send them valid messages for which they already have the justification. Otherwise, they just won't state transition. And attacks have to cause state transitions in the victims. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It just has no effect. So somehow, what our attacker is going to have to do is it's going to have to send messages that are valid to nodes that already have the messages of the justification in order to cause them to make decisions that are inconsistent with the decisions that other nodes make. And somehow the nodes that's producing this behavior is gonna they're going to be Byzantine, which is lingo that means can behave arbitrarily, is kind of lingo for an untyped fault. But actually, what we're gonna be able to do is we're going to tolerate, and we're going to be very specific about the kinds of Byzantine fault that we're going to tolerate, and we're going to show that if there's not more than some amount of this type of Byzantine fault, then we have consensus safety. And specifically, the kind of Byzantine fault that we're going to tolerate is called equivocation. Before I define it, I'll talk a little bit more in philosophical terms about what equivocation is. So imagine we have Alice over here. Alice is watching a bunch of nodes. She's watching a bunch of nodes on a consensus protocol. And she's trying to make decisions that are consistent with with Bob's decisions. Bob's over here on another point on the distributed system, And Bob is watching some nodes that are following the protocol, hopefully. And somehow, from the signals that Alice and Bob gets from these nodes, they're going to have to make consistent decisions. They're going to have to, out of mutually exclusive possibilities, make a choice where, like, if Alice so let's do the binary consensus. Like, Alice is going to have to choose between like 0 or 1, and like so will Bob. And the question is, like, why will they? Or why, the protocol has to provide a way for them to choose the same value. And it's going to actually be fundamentally impossible for the protocol to do that if Alice and Bob are looking at different nodes. So imagine if Alice and Bob are just looking at completely different executions of the protocol. Imagine if I drew them this way specifically because I wanted to create the situation where they're looking at different nodes, right? So like if Alice is looking at these guys and Bob is looking at those ones, they're looking at completely different nodes. They could be running completely independently, and for a non-trivial consensus protocol, that means that they could arrive to inconsistent outcomes, because a non-trivial consensus protocol can arrive at inconsistent outcomes. That's kind of the nature of non-triviality, is that you have a choice between mutually exclusive alternatives. So it's definitely clear that Alice and Bob can't be only looking at less than half of the nodes, because if they're looking at less than half the nodes, there's whatever protocol they're running, there's no way it's going to provide them a means of making consistent decisions. So they're going to have to look at some majority of nodes, but even if, imagine if Alice looked at all of them and Bob looked at all of them. Those nodes, if they're Byzantine, could be running two separate versions of the protocol, one for Alice and one for Bob. So even if Alice and Bob need to look at all the nodes, there's this kind of Byzantine fault where the node operator is running two versions of the protocol, one for Alice and one for Bob. That's like fundamentally enough to cause consensus failure, because an independent execution of the protocol can lead to decisions on independent values, and those independent values can therefore be inconsistent because they're chosen independently. So I'm going to define this notion of equivocation for this protocol specifically. So what equivocation is going to be, well, I'm going to draw it as perp. It's like perpendicular symbol, and it's a relation on messages such that one message is a equivocation with respect to another if they have the same sender and they're not the same message and they're not included in each other's justification. So this is kind of equivocation. This is this behavior that I kind of mentioned, which really is it's basically, so if a validator makes two messages which are not in each other's justification, what that essentially means is that we got two messages here from the same validator, and in their justification, so like they point to other messages, but there's no way to follow those pointers down to get to from one to the other or vice versa. So what that means is that this validator, this node, obviously isn't running the protocol in the sense of following the state transition relation of subset, because if they were, they would always be transitioning to a set that includes more messages than before, there's this additional kind of a constraint that's snuck in here, which is that when you send a message, you're kind of expected to receive it. So like when a validator sends a message, when they make a new message, they should always point to the old message that they made. So all the messages from validators who are not equivocating, who are not producing this, are totally ordered under membership in the justification. So this little independent logo basically says that M1 and M2 are not totally ordered by the justification. The other option is that they have the same justification, but they have different messages. So if you send two messages from the same state, that's also an equivocation. So two messages from the same state, or two messages from states that are not sequentially, or ordered by the subset relation, really, are an equivocation. So, I would like to stop because I, feel like that was a lot. So equivocation, same sender, different messages, but the messages don't include each other in their justification. I think it's a very natural notion of equivocation for our system, where state transition is just superset. But it does come out of thinking about fault tolerance and the fact that actually we're not going to be able to tolerate equivocation by 100% of the nodes. This is just like fundamentally impossible, because independent protocol executions could lead to independent decisions if there are any decisions that are possible at all. So, yeah, please. Anyone? Equivocation questions? Yeah, great.
One thing isn't sure for me, because you're talking about sender and a message, and I thought from the beginning that the sender is a part of the message.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so why do you talk, at least from this, I see like it's a separate sender for a message.
So if two messages have the same sender, it means that this part of the message is the same. So it's two different messages that have the same sender. We talk about it as if it's also the validator, or like the node that sent it, because like it's going to have, like in practice, like you're only going to be able to put a name there validly if you can produce a signature for that validator's account. And so the name, we're going to use source authentication to make sure that the names here aren't forgeable. And so it really is going to be, in some sense, from that sender. So we capture that intuition by calling it sender. But strictly speaking, it is just the projection on the second element of this tuple. Anyone else? Okay. Well, let's do some more stuff. We're almost there. We're almost at the protocol definition. We're almost done with the protocol definition, believe it or not. So we're going to count the equivocators. So the equivocators in some protocol state is a map from the protocol state to a set of validators. And it's just simply going to be the validators who have been observed to equivocate. So if you've been observed to equivocate in a protocol state, then you get added to this set called the equivocators. So this is like set builder notation. Somehow the first time I'm using it here. So this is all the validators V in the validator set, such that there exists, so the backward E means, two messages M1 and M2, each in the schema, such that they're an equivocation, and the sender is equal to this validator in question. So this is all of the equivocating validators, all the ones that are in some protocol state. So is equivocating. So what we're building here is like a notion of the faults, and then a way to count up the validators who have been equivocated, who have equivocated. So these are the equivocators. Finally, we're gonna tolerate some amount of equivocators, but we're actually going to tolerate it by weight. So there's something. So our validators are going to have a weight. So the weight is going to map the validator set to positive real numbers. So this is kind of the weights of the different validators. We do this kind of without loss of generality because we could always set the weights to be 1. And so the fault weight is a map from protocol states to real numbers, such that essentially the fault weight at some protocol state is equal to the sum of the validators who are, the sum of the weights of the validators who are equivocating. Sorry about getting way down here. I'm going to raise it in a second. Oops, sorry about that. It's a little V. So basically what I've said is, oh, look. I'm not sure if everyone in the back can see this, but so we had this notion of equivocations, a way to count the equivocators, the weights of the various equivocators, and then the total sum of the weights of the equivocators. So this big F, capital F, counts the weight of the faulty nodes. So I went from defining what this fault was to totaling up the weight of the nodes who've been observed to be faulty. Yes, John.
So does that mean that each type of equivocation counts the same?
So if I equivocate, so it doesn't matter which equivocation I make as a validator, it's always going to count, basically it's going to count for 0 if I've already seen to be equivocating, or for my total weight if I haven't already been seen to be equivocating. Martin?
The estimator is global, right? The estimator function is shared within all validators?
Yes, that's right. So actually, for now, the way I'm presenting this is that all of the validators are sharing all of these things, but actually, I'm going to be able to show that they don't need to share this new parameter that I haven't introduced yet, which is going to be the fault tolerance threshold. So all of these guys are going to be shared, like the V, the C, the estimator, the weights. That's going to be all part of the protocol.
But an invalid message isn't an equivocation.
Not an equivocation. Yeah. Definitely, these nodes can't receive them. Nodes running in this gamma can't receive invalid messages. You could produce an invalid message, but it won't cause any behavior in the nodes running gamma. Sorry, go ahead. So basically, the reason why we have weights for the validators is because we're in preparation for a proof of stake. So because we're gonna eventually have weighted nodes because of in the public context, we can't really prevent Sybil attacks, and so allowing for weights is the kind of natural thing, because instead of having someone run 20 nodes, where they'll just have one node with 20 times as much weight, but it's also without loss of generality in the sense that if you wanted to have equal weights, it's fine. It's not that doesn't. I'm not making any constraints on what this weight is other than they have to be positive. It's entirely basically in preparation for proof of stake. It's a parameter of the protocol, but it's going to be the deposits. Yeah, the more consensus forming weight you have, yeah. And it's a fundamental issue because it's fundamental in the sense that there's no way to solve it. Because if you said, everyone has to be the same size, then the guy with the 20, with the whale would just make lots of accounts and lots of identities. And so there's no way to, as far as we know with our toolkit and distributed systems, to deal with that problem. Yes. So equivocation, the question is, does it relate to double spending? Yeah, it totally does, in that double spending in proof of work systems can be caused 100% by equivocation faults. So if you, and more broadly, consensus failure can always be caused by equivocation. And consensus failure could be used to double spend if you cause someone to believe they received money that the rest of the network doesn't believe they received. And that's very possible in a consensus failure setting. So we're really just about done here. There's only one more constraint. There's only one more constraint that I have on the protocol states, and then we'll be totally done. So we have this other parameter, this last parameter, called the fault tolerance threshold, and it's going to be a number. Could be 0, and it's going to be less than the total weights of the validators. And finally, I'm going to have one last constraint. So basically, anything in our protocol states gamma, we're going to have the fault weight be not more than T. Okay, and my magical claim now is that this is a fault tolerant consensus. Like gamma plus the superset relation is a fault tolerant consensus protocol. And this guy's with specifically that will tolerate up to T weight fault threshold. So this is like the fault tolerance threshold. So basically, I'm gonna go around and circle the things that haven't yet been fully defined. So consensus values, we didn't say what they were. The validator set, we didn't say what they were. estimator, we didn't say what it was. The weights, we didn't say what they were. And also this fault tolerance threshold T, we didn't say what it was. So the claim here is that for every choice of these values within the constraints that are given, like, it has to satisfy this function, it has to be between those bounds, has to satisfy this function signature. Something I didn't mention, like these guys can't be empty. Few constraints, but no matter what you do for those constraints, no matter how you choose these guys, they're going to form a consensus-safe consensus protocol. And I'm going to, in a moment, show you, try to convince you of that. Yeah.
And the set of validator is constant, or the protocol can tolerate falling out.
Yeah. So the point of this presentation is to give something minimal. A protocol that changes the validators is more sophisticated and out of scope right now. But the way that will be done is actually by spinning up new instances of protocols which have new validator sets that maybe kicked out the ones that were, say, faulty. But the minimal spec here, this validator set is like a constant. It's like part of the protocol. That's like kind of, just because if you want to solve the simplest consensus protocol problem, like that's kind of, at least for asynchronously safe consensus, that's kind of what you have to do. Because if you don't know the validator set, or at least if you don't know a bound on the size of the validator set, then you can't do asynchronously safe consensus protocols. And that's actually something I didn't mention, but all of this is an asynchronous protocol definition. I haven't constrained at all the message arrival order, or when people will send messages or anything like that. I've just given the full node protocol, like the full node, fully validating protocol. And then I'm going to prove that no matter what you do with these choices of things that aren't defined yet, like it's going to be a consensus-safe protocol. Steve?
So equivocations, they go in the justification set and they're there forever.
Yes. That's the way this is currently set up, yeah. Although, let me say that, like, you don't actually need, depending on the estimator, you may or may not need to store all those equivocations, right? And so for the estimators that we look at, are really driven by the messages from honest nodes only. And so after you see a single equivocation, we get to stop looking. But that's because we only really care ultimately about decisions on consensus values, and the estimator is the way that we relate protocol states to consensus values. And so actually we can kind of further constrain the protocol state space to once we know, or if we know something about the estimator. And so if we knew, for example, the estimator didn't care about new equivocations, then we can add a constraint here where it says, I'm not going to be able to transition from one, basically what I can do is I can remove anything from gamma if it has more than 2 equivocations from any validator. So that basically, like, all messages, all new equivocations from that validator would be deleted. I could probably could come up with a better constraint maybe on the state transition relation, where basically, like, a state transition is only allowed if it's not not containing any messages from validators who have already seen to be equivocated. But this is meant to be the minimal thing in terms of what's shareable. That should give you the key insights and, like, results, a key kind of, core problem solution. More than it's, like, designed to be practical.
But as stated, 2 equivocations are kind of permanent. Like once you've equivocated once, your weight is going to get added to that fault function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. There's no way to get out of the equivocator weights here. Once there is an equivocation, there's an equivocation forever, because we don't forget. We never forget. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But in practice, what's going to happen is the validator set is going to rotate every X blocks, and so the equivocators will just leave the validator set and, like, not be part of the new one. And so, like, and the messages for the new validator set will be new messages. From a new validator set. And there'll be no equivocators at first. Yep.
So if we have a visiting node is sending different messages to different people, how does the network find out that this node is visiting?
Well, this is so I mean, hopefully they're lucky enough to receive the messages. The other answer is honest nodes will gossip messages and they'll gossip equivocations. And so because of gossip, they should find out. But it's definitely, I definitely can't prove that they will find out here. Like, I've not made enough assumptions here to prove that.
Okay, so there's some sort of echo messages they're sending, and it's like, hey, I got this from this node, and then, oh, wait, you got something different, and then
Yeah. Yeah, and also the full node condition means that, like, if there's a equivocation in the justification of a message, you can't miss it if you receive that message. And so there kind of is, it does force you to receive equivocations that anyone has seen if you want to receive that message. Great, so now I'm going to state the two kind of key theorems that that basically are, why this is all here, and hopefully it'll make a little more sense. Oops. Oh no. Okay, so we have two kind of key theorems. One of them is called the common features theorem. So what this basically is going to say it basically says that if the fault weight in the union of a bunch of protocol states is not more than t, then the intersection of the futures of these guys is not empty. So this is kind of our cornerstone theorem. This is like everything has been set up so that this theorem holds, and it's where we get all of our safety, and it's really like deserving of the title Theorem 1. What this says is, if the fault weight of the union of a bunch of states is less than t, then they're going to have a common future. And so what are futures? Well, I mentioned that state transition is superset, and so the futures of a protocol state are all supersets. So basically, let me just to make sure you guys see it. So the futures of gamma is basically all of the gamma primes, gamma, such that it's a superset. Right? Because the state transition is superset, and so all the futures are all the supersets. So again, fault weight less than t means that they have some future in common. There exists a future, some state, some protocol state, right? Some gamma, which each of them could transition to. And so here's kind of like my claim and observation is basically that actually, over here, this union is a protocol state. So my claim is that this union of these messages, in this case, is a protocol state. Well, let me convince you. The union of two sets of valid messages is going to itself be valid. If I have one set of messages here and it has all the dependencies of its messages, and I have another set of messages here and it has the dependencies of all of its messages, when I take the union of those, I'm also going to get a set which is complete under membership and justification. So my claim is that taking the union of two protocol states gives you a new set of messages which is going to be a set of messages that's both valid and complete under the full node definition. So the claim is that under union, we're going to satisfy, if we're taking a union of protocol states, then we're going to get a new set of messages, which is going to be valid messages, which are closed under membership and justification. It's going to be basically a set of messages that satisfies those two constraints. And then furthermore, by our assumption here, it satisfies the last constraint that we need to be a protocol state, that it has not more than t faults. Remember, there's three constraints that you need to be a protocol state. You need to be a finite set of messages, that are all valid, that is closed under justification, and which has not more than T faults. He tried to argue that a union of valid messages is a set of valid messages, and a union of messages that are complete on the justification is complete on the justification, and by our assumption, this union has less than T faults. So therefore, this union is actually a protocol state. And furthermore, for all of these J's, gamma J is totally a subset of this union. So not only is it a protocol state, but it's a subset, which means that this is the same thing as saying that that this guy is in the futures of this guy, because that's the definition of futures is just that you're a superset. So basically we have that this union is in the futures of each of the protocol states that are in the union, and that completes the proof, right? Because if it's in each of them, then it's in their intersection. So this is kind of theorem one. It's like key theorem that like the whole safety of the protocol is based on. It's like really deep and fundamental, and it follows from just really the fact that the protocol states are pretty much any set of messages, but which don't have too many faults. And so that like imagine if we didn't have this not too many faults constraint, then kind of trivially any two states would have a common feature state, because the union would trivially be a protocol state. But now in our context, the feature state is only guaranteed if there's not more than T faults. As soon as there's more than T faults, there's actually not going to be a common feature state, because that protocol state, the union of those states is not a protocol state, because it's only a protocol state if there's more than T faults. Sorry, if there's not more than T faults. So we have this big lattice. This is actually a big lattice. This guy under superset is a big lattice where every points have a join. And then what we do is we remove a whole bunch of points from this lattice, all the ones that have too many faults. And somehow, that actually weakens our result we could have had before, which is that we always have a common feature. And now we only have a common feature if there's not too many faults. And it turns out that is kind of totally what we want, because it's going to give us it's going to let us have non-triviality, and it's going to be possible to understand that kind of when you look at Theorem 2. So Theorem 2 is the consensus safety theorem, and it's going to follow pretty much immediately from Theorem 1. Theorem 2 is basically consensus safety. Consensus safety. So what this is going to say is like, oh, look, if there's not too much faults, then we have consistent decisions. So if the fault weight is not more than T, then what we're going to get is consistent decisions. Well, I haven't told you yet what consistent means and what decisions are. So this is a good moment, as good a moment as any. So what are decisions? Well, we're not really sure at the moment, right? We're not really sure, but I'm going to partially specify. So what are decisions going to do? We're going to map protocol states to properties of consensus values. So sounds weird, but so the properties of consensus values is basically going to be all of the maps from consensus values to true and false. So why am I doing this? Well, what's the deal? So I don't want to decide directly on consensus values. So it turns out that I want to decide actually on properties of consensus values. So for a binary consensus, it's kind of okay to decide on a value. But in a blockchain consensus, if we were ever to decide on a blockchain, we'd be stuck there forever. This would be our decision, and we'd be done. Like, we always want to be able to continue building the blockchain, And so what we do instead is we decide on a property like this block is in the chain. And then you can make that decision, and that doesn't preclude you from having new blocks in the chain later. And so by deciding on properties of consensus values as opposed to consensus values directly, we're able to have a consensus protocol that can definitely make more and more decisions and never kind of be stuck and stopped like on a single value. So a decision is going to take protocol states and give us sets of consensus values, and we have this following kind of decision discipline, which is going to really help us, which is going to really kind of put all of this story kind of together. So if we have some property as a decision for some protocol state, what that means is that for all future states, for all future states of that state, for all values of the estimator in those future states, this property holds. So this is kind of our decision discipline. So this I don't know how to write. There we go. So this decision discipline basically says, oh look, I'm not really going to say how you have to make decisions, but you're only allowed to decide on properties of consensus values when they invariantly hold for all values of the estimator for all future protocol states. So if you're at some protocol state, that state has a value of the estimator, which gives you some consensus values. And all future states also has some value of the estimator, that gives you some consensus values. And only if all of those states and all the future states, this property is invariant, then you're allowed to decide on it. And so the kind of key kind of idea here is that by only deciding on invariant properties of protocol states, we are going to get consensus safety from the existence of our common future state. So if we have a common future state, then anything that's invariant in our protocol states are going to be mutually consistent because they all hold at our common future state. So anything that's invariant in all your future states holds at all your futures, and if we have a common future state, then all of our invariants are going to hold there, and therefore are going to be consistent. And what do we mean by consistent? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's going to be a map from properties of protocol states to true or false. And specifically, they're going to be consistent only if there exists a consensus value that satisfies them. So a bunch of properties are consistent if they can all be satisfied together, or they're inconsistent if they can't be jointly satisfied. And so our decisions are consistent in this sense because there exists a consensus value that satisfies all of them. Namely, any of the consensus values in the estimator of our common futures will satisfy all of them. And so from the existence of the common future, we can find an example of a consensus value that satisfies all of the properties that we've decided on, and therefore we can conclude that the properties that we've decided on are consistent. Because, well, for something to be in here, it has to be true in all future states. And if we have a common future state, then all of the properties that are true there for each of these gamma i's are also going to be hold at that common future. Since all of the properties hold at the common future, and the estimator gives us at least one consensus value at that future, we can use the estimator to pick any of these consensus values. If you're willing to accept the axiom of choice or the finite axiom of choice, then we can pick one of these values and therefore show that they're consistent because we found a value that satisfies all the properties that people decided on. So Theorem 1 says, oh look, we have a common future. Theorem 2 says, if we decide on stuff only when it's invariant in all our future states, then our decisions are going to be consistent. And kind of this consistency follows kind of immediately from Theorem 1 because it's all rooted in the existence of the common future state. Yes?
Is it
No, it's always the union. The union is always a common future state. So there's, if you had an infinite number of protocol states you're considering, right? There's always going to be a future that's arbitrarily far away, because all supersets of this guy are protocol states also that are also going to be common futures, by virtue of being a future of our common future. Yeah, and the other thing to note is that we never actually have to achieve a common future state. Just the fact that it exists is enough to guarantee our consistency. We don't. It has to be possible for us to reach it, so that when we calculate local invariance, that we get to have this consistency with all of the local invariants that are calculated across the network. But the neat thing is that we don't actually need to make decisions on the same values. Nothing here really forces us to make the same decisions. It only really makes us make consistent decisions. And so we don't, actually it might be bad for us to achieve a common future state. But we do want to guarantee that it exists so that we have this discipline for making decisions in a consistent manner via detecting invariance. So the kind of the key setup here is that if there's not too many faults, there's a common future state. And you detect local invariance as a way to make decisions. And the local invariants, are consistent just via this common future state. And so kind of the claim is that, like, oh, look, I've just shown consensus safety for this family of consensus protocols, which it contains all sorts of different consensus protocols on all sorts of different consensus values, including the like binary consensus protocols, this friendly ghost consensus protocol that our chain is implementing, and a bunch of other consensus protocols that aren't developed yet, and that we're just waiting for you to make nice choices of the estimator to find. Because the art in constructing consensus protocols with this framework is choosing the consensus value and the estimator in a way where you actually can detect when you have invariant properties, or in a way where actually you do have invariant properties for the protocol states that you do have invariant properties of consensus values for things that the user actually cares about. So you might want to detect for a user whether or not their balance is safely received. And that would be an example of a property of a consensus value, and you'd need to, and the consensus values might be, say, the state of a ledger, and the estimator would be something that maps protocol states to, possible states of the ledger, which represent kind of the best guess from that particular protocol state. So basically, if you choose these things badly, then you don't actually get a useful consensus protocol, even though it's consensus safe. Maybe won't make any decisions. It maybe will be impossible to determine when it does make a decision. So there's definitely an art to picking these guys. Yeah.
So how does this relate to classical Byzantine protocols?
Yeah.
The lower bounds, for example, the threshold.
Great question. Fantastic question. Yes. Yes. Great question. Fantastic question. And I have a drawing that I like to make to answer this question, because the traditional bound is based on this notion of consensus that includes both safety and liveness as a requirement, and a notion of Byzantine fault that's completely untyped. Whereas our notion of we haven't proven liveness at all, right? And our notion of faults are typed, and I can show you kind of how this all relates. So what I'm going to draw is a graph here. This is going to be the number of faults over here, and this is the kind of quorum size. So this is the kind of number of nodes that you need to hear from to make a decision. This is the number of faults that you can tolerate. So we kind of showed earlier by looking through this informal argument that if you hear from less than half of the nodes, then there's no way you can be safe. So if this is 50, this is 1/2, then you can't tolerate any Byzantine faults whatsoever until you get to more than a half. At which point there is some ability to tolerate some faults, maybe 0 at just above a half, and then And then the amount of faults you can tolerate goes up in your quorum size to, so this is going to be this line here. The most faults you could possibly tolerate for consensus safety is the total weight. I'll call it the total weight minus epsilon, but you have to realize that the epsilon here is the weight of the smallest validator. Not really epsilon, but just the smallest weight. So that's kind of the most you could tolerate for safety. And as long as you'd have less than this line number of faults, then it's possible to achieve safety. So like all of this area, this is kind of the area where, well, I guess it stops there. So this is kind of the safety area. This is where it's possible to have consensus safety. If you have more faults than this, if your quorum is like here, then you need to have like less than that number of faults in order to be safe. And so this is kind of the safety area. This is where it's possible to be safe against this number of faults. But for liveness, we have a very different line, where basically like if our quorum size is here, then if like there's this much nodes offline, it's like a little more than that, then they can stop our quorum from forming, and we don't have liveness anymore. And so the liveness line actually looks like this, where basically if you require just epsilon for a decision, it's super unsafe, then like all but epsilon could go offline, and you would still have liveness. And in here, if you required everyone for the decision, then if epsilon went offline, then you would totally lose liveness. So we go from here. So we have the straight line from here to there. Sorry, it's supposed to be a straight line. It's supposed to be a straight line. And then all of this area here is where it's possible to have liveness. So this is the liveness area. So what normally we say, the reasoning goes, okay, we want to be safe and live, and we want to tolerate Byzantine faults, which are untyped Byzantine faults. They could be either equivocating to attack safety or going offline and preventing our quorum from failing. So the most we could tolerate, conventional wisdom says, is 1/3 Byzantine faults. Because it's going to be the intersection of these lines, we're going to actually have to be like under those lines, right? So this is like where the 1/3 number comes from. You want to be as high as possible while still being like squarely inside the safety and liveness zones. But like what I like insist is the reality is actually that what we're choosing here is not 1/3 Byzantine faults. What we're choosing here is 1/3. What this really is 1/3 tolerance to equivocation and 1/3 tolerance, like very much, and 1/3 tolerance to liveness faults. So this is like crashing. So I'm letting you pick this T wherever you want, right? So what does this actually translate into? Well, so imagine if you picked your T here. Normally we'd be like, no way, you can't tolerate more than 1/3 and be live. Well, true in some way, if you want me to tolerate that same number of liveness faults. But really, the fundamental trade-off actually is like this. So this is the number of faults this is like the T from the spec, so the equivocation fault tolerance. So for the equivocation fault tolerance, you go up to the safety line, you drop down to the liveness line, and then go back, and then this is the maximum amount of liveness faults that I could tolerate. So this 1/3, it just happens to be that this kind of process, says, you can tolerate 1/3. You choose to tolerate 1/3 for liveness. You can tolerate, 1/3 for safety. Then you can tolerate up to 1/3 for liveness. But if I choose T for safety, then there's going to be some amount that I can tolerate most for liveness. What is that? Well, we should just calculate TL in terms of TE. maybe I can do this by memory, and so I don't have to calculate it. So, well, basically, if we tolerate TE faults for equivocation, then we have 2T minus total weight. So basically, well, what's this line, right? This line is total weight minus epsilon. This is 2T minus total weight minus epsilon, and this is total weight minus epsilon minus T. So 2T. So the quorum size that we need is right. So I this T here is this guy, this axis. Sorry to do math on the fly here. So this guy is going to be, so this is the size of the quorum, and for it to be available and online, we need to have this be less than the total weight minus the faulty nodes, who are the Liveness faults. And so basically, the like as a result, it's minus epsilon there too. It looks like 2TE minus the total weight. So anyways, maybe you should get me with this later, but basically the amount of faults that you can tolerate for liveness, it trades off against the amount of faults that you have to that you tolerate for safety, and you get 2 points of fault tolerance for safety for every 1 point of liveness that you're willing to give up. So when I move away here and I sacrifice on a point of fault tolerance for liveness, I can get 2 points of fault tolerance for safety. And so the 1/3, 1/3 number, I think, is kind of maybe a little bit too conservative, because 1/3, 1/3 is actually maybe arguably less fault tolerance than, say, like 1/2 against safety and 1/4 against liveness. And actually, it's really hard to tell in practice because this is not a fault tolerance-based system at the end of the day, but a public economic system where it's going to be rational for people to be online. And the different faults of safety and liveness faults are going to be penalized differently. And it's super unclear that we should treat the faults in an untyped manner. So the kind of critique of the 1/3 thing is that it uses untyped faults. And if you use typed faults and think about liveness faults versus equivocation faults, you see that like actually these are mutually exclusive faults. You cannot both be offline and equivocating. Yeah, sorry. Totally over time. Anyways, thanks for listening. Ask me more after, because I could do better. I can do better than this.